All right, my friend, another question or topic from the community.
Yes, these are some of my favorite. And I think this is going to be a fun one because we did very minimal conversation before this. And we decided that it would be a little bit more fun to just dive right in without knowing the other's opinion. So this conversation is going to be a little bit off the cuff, which I'm looking forward to.
Yeah, man, unscripted here.
That's right.
Here's a question that was submitted from Coach JMac. He says, you really enjoyed the episode on what CrossFit gets wrong. Got me thinking about some related things. As I age up as an athlete, I'm definitely feeling stronger and probably better conditioned, but I feel less athletic. I played a lot of sports, soccer, basketball, football, baseball in my life, and my bread and butter was my quickness and lateral agility. I feel like this is one area typical CrossFit programming misses. I know the quote-unquote regularly learn and play new sports could help with this, but I quite honestly don't have the time with 2 young daughters in competitive sports. So maybe this is a 2-part question. Number 1, does CrossFit make you less athletic? And number 2, how can we program to get out of the up and down, forward and back planes we often train in? There
Great
you have
questions.
it. Yeah, I think it is a great, hence why we're discussing it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, do you want me to dive right into my answer to the first question?
You can. I've got thoughts as well. So yeah, go
Okay.
ahead, and then I'll piggyback off there.
Well, the first question, does CrossFit make you less athletic? I think I can answer that with a pretty resounding no. And I don't mean to be overly simplistic about it, but I think what makes you less athletic is doing athletic things less. And so if you were an athlete in a past life, you did all sorts of different mixed sports. And as the years have gone on, you've taken on other responsibilities, you get further and further away from engaging with those sports. Well, I think it's pretty fair to say that the attributes that those sports demand will also dampen. And I don't think that's because you're pursuing an activity like CrossFit. I think it's because you're not pursuing these other things. And so I think you just got to be careful to mix the cause and effect. I don't think participating in CrossFit is dampening your athleticism. I think not pursuing athletic things is dampening your perceived athleticism. I go the opposite way and say that, engaging in CrossFit, particularly if you're really focused on some of the more technical aspects of it, is going to preserve some basic athleticism. Now, is it going to translate perfectly to your ability to hit a fastball or, make a catch on the fly, that sort of thing? Probably not, because those are very kind of specialized things. But the basics of your coordination and agility, et cetera, can be preserved by maintaining some of these CrossFit movements. So to me, the question always kind of boils down to that old economics line of compared to what? Does it make you less athletic compared to what? Compared to somebody who's still maintaining those types of sports in their regular routine? Yeah, you're probably not going to be as athletic, quote unquote. But compared to somebody who's just engaging in a normal bodybuilding routine, your athleticism is going to be a far cry better, in my opinion. So that's where I'm at with that first question.
Yeah, and it's funny. I actually had Thomas Sowell in my head as well with the whole. With the whole compared to what. So, that first one, does CrossFit make you less athletic? Well, first of all, earlier on in his paragraph, he says, as I age, I'm feeling less athletic. Yes. That's just a yes. You will most likely, if you were a young athlete playing, doesn't just look like you played some sports. Sounds like you played all of them. You named soccer, basketball, football, baseball. If that was most of your youth and teenage years and potentially into college and all that, and you were just on all this different athletic domains, there's a good chance that when you're 65, you will be less athletic than when you were doing that all the time. So as you age, you're feeling less athletic. My answer to that is yes. That just makes absolute perfect sense to me. But that being said, the question, does CrossFit make you less athletic? Then I had exactly what you said, compared to what? It matters what you did before CrossFit. If you are somebody like me, who, by the way, I am not athletic. You talk about, I understand the difference between work capacity and the ability to suffer and athleticism. You want to suffer and do some burpees and deadlifts and sprints, yeah, I'll see you there. You want somebody to be like a great pinch hitter on your club softball team? I am not the one that you want, regardless of my deadlift or power clean or explosive hip ability. I will strike out every time on the plate because it's just not how I spent my time in ball sports or things like that. It's so again, compared to what was your previous background before that? So for somebody who, like me, wasn't an athlete when I was young, and my quote unquote, athleticism, if I don't even want to say that, was single joint machine-based movements that I didn't have to stabilize my midline, didn't require any balance. Like now me doing CrossFit and not sitting my butt on a machine and doing Nautilus and trying to receive a squat snatch or do box jumps and kipping pull-ups and double unders and power cleans, like the demand of athleticism in my strength and conditioning life has skyrocketed since doing CrossFit. But that's because of where I came from. Now you take somebody, like my wife, who was a games athlete or a D1 collegiate gymnast for her, and that means she was a gymnast since she was 3 years old. Yes, she's less athletic now as a 40-year-old woman with 3 kids than she was when she was spending 6 hours a day doing gymnastics. It's just the nature of the beast. So it's also, for me, yes, more athletic. For her, less athletic. Yet both of us are still wonderfully fit, conditioned, strong, ready for life. So I think a big part of that is the compared to what. I think that is a huge, huge part of that. And athleticism is an interesting thing if we're talking about it as its own category outside of fitness, which, I believe it deserves that. Much like fitness, which is to some degree a use it or lose it sort of a thing. If I stop working out, I can watch my squat and deadlift plummet. It is what it is. I think it's the same thing with doing something which requires hand-eye coordination, having an external object like a bat, a hockey stick, a ball. Are you cutting laterally, pivoting, turning? Like, sure, I can absolutely see it's a use it or lose it sort of a thing. But that is, I think I've said this in a previous podcast, and it's not all encompassing, but it helps paint the picture that, Greg Glassman, you would get a question, something similar to this at a level 1 about CrossFit and sport-specific training and this, that, the other thing. And he was always very quick to say, it's like, look, if you're from almost any sport, you can come to my gym and I'm going to make you strong and explosive and powerful, and your conditioning will be through the roof. But if you're a fighter, you might get knocked out in the first round because I don't know how to teach you how to fight, or you might strike out every time you're at the plate. You still need to go do your sport, and that's probably where a tremendous amount of what most people consider that raw athleticism to live. And CrossFit is your strength and conditioning base from which hopefully that other thing can flourish. I would say that's kind of just something to have in the back of your head.
Yeah, I agree. And to just expand on that a little bit more, I think that it's important when you're looking at a strength and conditioning program, CrossFit, what you're really developing are the raw materials that you can then take and mold into something athletic. You're not developing that specific skill for whatever sport it is that you're pursuing. It's giving you the foundation or the platform that you can spring from. And so I think a question that might be interesting for this individual to ask themselves is, okay, in their youth, they were really athletic, meaning they were participating in all these different sports, and these sports demanded a high level of hand-eye coordination, thinking on the fly, reacting to the moment, things like that. Fast forward a couple of decades, and those decisions, those types of environments are less readily available. They're just not as trained. Okay, you can expect to see a diminishing of your skills in that, like you mentioned. What I think would be an interesting approach is to say, all right, what are the raw physical capabilities that you have? And if you were to apply them back into those situations, let's say you were to pick up rec league soccer. I know they said they didn't have the time to do that, but let's pretend that they had the time to jump right in and go for it. What is the time to reacquire some of that skill? And my bet is that time is pretty diminished because you don't have to worry about, am I out of breath when I'm trying to get to the ball? Am I, do I have the physical capability and the basics of agility and coordination to perform some of these movements. They'll feel rusty and they're certainly not going to be polished, but you're likely to experience an accelerated timeline to get back in the saddle, so to speak. And I think that's a pretty interesting metric to start viewing things from. And then another thing on top of that, as far as athleticism, and I think this is something people discount all the time, is that skill is very, very, very fatigue dependent.
Oh, sure.
And what I mean by that is if you have somebody who's extremely skilled, but they fatigue easily, that skill goes away very fast. And so the more fatigue resistant that you are as an athlete, the more you can continue to display that skill. And CrossFit is outstanding at developing that kind of fatigue resistance. That's kind of the bread and butter of the program. And so even if you have somebody with a moderate skill set, but they can continue to apply that moderate skill at minute 1 and then minute 180 in the game, if you have a long game, let's say, that's a really, really difficult person to come up against in any given sport versus somebody who's a superstar for the first 10 minutes, but then they fall apart after the half. That's no good. So a couple of different things to kind of filter there as well. What would be the uptake to get back to a comparable, maybe not comparable, but like an appreciable level of skill? And how much does having that raw physical capability help that? And then how much of a benefit is it to have that kind of fatigue resistance so that you can continue to display your skill? I think those are some really, really important questions when we start talking about the application of athleticism.
Yeah, and then maybe it's a good time to segue to the second question, which is question number 2 is, or you get more on number 1.
Yeah, let me give one more kind of thought on that before we segue, because I do think this is important. And I think this is especially important for people that have been doing CrossFit for a while. I think, like you said, there's a tendency to gravitate towards engine above all else. And what I mean by that is that I no longer consider how I get the work done. Like, obviously, I keep my technique safe and decent, but I don't really care about what it looks like as long as I keep moving. I can just kind of trudge my way through things. And I'll give you a perfect example, the lowly burpee. How many of us are guilty of this when the going gets tough? Your burpee is just this flopping, doesn't matter if I'm standing up on one leg, throwing myself back down on the ground. It just
There's a name for those. They're called grief burpees. Grief burpees.
There you go. And certainly at times it's appropriate to train that way because you're just trying to gut it out and grind through it. However, I think there's a lot of utility in forcing yourself into, I'm going to keep the technique crisp. I'm going to try to execute these as beautifully as possible. Even if that means I've got to rest a little bit more, that's the goal for the day because that is demanding that I'm a little bit sharper in my quote athleticism than I would be otherwise. And that's a harder standard to maintain sometimes, but I do think it's important to focus on that training from time to time. Hey, the focus for today isn't the fastest time or the grittiest effort. It's on the best execution. And that's a great way to start highlighting some of those attributes more often than maybe you would otherwise.
No, I think that's fair. Well, now, segue into number 2, which I think some of these things are going to...
I'll get off my soapbox now.
I think some of them are even going to overlap here
sure.
as well. So question, if it's a 2-part question, this one specifically is, how can we program to get out of the up-down, forwards, backwards planes that we often train? So that's the question. Fair question, completely. I would say I would potentially maybe reword it, or what jumped out at me when I read the question is the question implies that it is necessary. Like, how can we program to get out of these planes? And if you're asking that, it's because these planes must not be serving the purpose. And so we have to do something different because the purpose, we're falling short, we're deficient, we're failing. There's weaknesses, there's cracks in the system. I would argue, I've seen a lot of CrossFit in my life, that I haven't seen that in all that I've experienced. And I would argue that potentially, if somebody has a desire, and as I've said on many of these things, you're a wonderful, free, autonomous citizen to desire whatever you want to desire. So if you have a desire for more lateral work, you have a desire for agility drills, you have a desire for whatever it is, rock on, fantastic. But I would categorize that into the want more than the need. And that's perfectly valid and completely good to go. So if you want to layer some more of those things into your training because you enjoy it or for whatever particular reason, there are certainly ways that you can do it. Now, if we're talking about, in my opinion, what CrossFit is, and CrossFit is not magic, right? It's by design, as you've said, I've stolen this from you, it's a minimalist program that with this astonishingly, relatively speaking, we still do a lot of different stuff, but small repertoire of functional movements and time domains and loadings and intensity, the transference from what we do is absolutely through the roof. So if it is a minimalist program by design, well, that is your fantastic foundation and base layer that you can either use as is and will serve the masses astonishingly well without the need for more. But if you would, for whatever reason, potentially like to layer or sprinkle a little something in on there, I think you're absolutely authorized to do that. But I would just say it's more of a want and not so much of a need.
Yeah, well, number one, I'm glad that you dropped the R in repertoire. That was really nice, Pat. So
thank you.
1 point for being classy. But I agree. I think that the necessity of a lot of lateral or twisting movements or whatever is really overblown in most cases. And I certainly have been in my experience that I don't see them moving the needle that much. I mean, it can be fun to mess around with, but I think in the pie slice of where you're going to focus your training, it should be relatively minimal because, there's a reason that every strength and conditioning program on earth has as its bread and butter the big basic lifts. Those are the ones that are going to push the needle furthest in the least amount of time. You start adding some basic gymnastics, you start adding some of these other skills that CrossFit incorporates, you're going to have a pretty healthy spread of covering your bases. So yeah, if you want to dabble with that, I would recommend that it doesn't start to dominate some of these other, in my opinion, more important aspects. And so warm-ups and cool-downs can be a great way. Hey, set up the hurdles. Let's warm up going over these and just practicing some different patterns from time to time. Doesn't have to take up the whole training session, but you can touch it and you can get some of that benefit and then move on. That can be a great way to start to push that in there. I'll give you a couple other really fun real-world examples that have been tried and true. Warm up with some basic gross sports. I think it's a lot of fun. Whenever I used to be traveling to affiliates more regularly, there was often, like a basketball hoop in an affiliate that we'd go to. It's a fun thing to do. Grab the hoop and shoot around for 5 minutes before you start the bulk of your workout. It's a great way to kind of grease the groove on some of that stuff, play around with something different, and then get to the business of the day. And I've even taken it as far as at lunchtime. I have some really fond memories at gyms with a basketball hoop where we would incorporate that into our Sunday workout. One of my favorite memories of this of all time was being in Red Deer, Alberta in Canada at Jason McDonald's old gym. And he had a basketball and we were messing around with it. And we decided that we were going to do a game of knockout. And we're set the time for 10 minutes. And the first 10 minutes, anytime you got out, you owed, I think it was 1 round of Cindy. And then you get back in and go to the back of the line. And you just kept playing until the 10 minutes were up. And every time you got out, you just did a round of Cindy and got back in. Stopped. And then we took a break. And the next round was 10 minutes. And I think it was clean and jerks. We had 185 on the bar, something like that. When you got out, you owed a couple of clean and jerks and then you got back in.
It was probably
we did that. Yeah, we did that through a couple of different iterations. I think we played all in for about 45 minutes. It was a great lunchtime sweat session. It wasn't too serious. We got to move around. We got to do some things that we didn't normally do. Now, was the intensity as high as maybe if we just did Cindy or just did Grace or something like that? No, but it was a great Sunday session that broke us out of that mold and got some really fun kind of outside the box type of things in there. And that's kind of the antidote that I would suggest where, if we look at learning and playing new sports, it doesn't have to be read as a long-term commitment to a bunch of different sports. And I think that's the world that a lot of people enter into or that they're coming from. It's like, hey, when I hear sports in my past, it was I would play for multiple seasons every year from this date to this date. And it was a serious thing that involved practice and games and all that. Most of us in our adult life, we don't have time for that. That's just the nature of it. So, okay. Dabbling in these other activities can have a huge, huge carryover and a lot of positive benefit. And it doesn't have to be anything more than once in a while I mess around. I go drop in at the climbing gym once every couple of weeks. Hey, that's got a huge benefit. It's fun. Go do it. Once in a while, I pick up the basketball, and that's how I warm up for my workout. Once in a while, I grab a softball, and me and the 10 other people in the gym, we play dodgeball for a few minutes. Like those types of things, dabbling can be a proxy for learning and playing new sports, in the sense that it doesn't have to be the season-long big commitment, etc. So that's my take. Be comfortable being a dabbler.
Yeah, we've got a basketball hoop in the driveway, and the boys will be out there regularly. And if I'm starting to walk into the gym for a workout, there's always a call for me to come out there. First of all, they know because they can just beat the stuffing out of me, so it's very enjoyable for them. I've already said that I'm not athletic. So I'll head out there and let them just beat me silly, for 10 or 15 minutes, and I'm running around. And even though I don't do that stuff, I'm still able to stop, start, pivot, rotate, do all the things, that I'm supposed to be doing, without spending too much time training on them. And it's a fun little warm, gets me, warmed up a little bit. Then I still need to go in and make sure I get below parallel or whatnot. But yeah, it's great and it's fun. And, you probably don't know this, but I will say, I've made, I think, the majority of my points in this, but I also will say that I think some, be it agility drills, lateral, whatever you're talking about, I think there's value there. And maybe not where people initially think. When I think of it and I think of the value, I don't think of, even though it transfers to the 40-year-old who wants to get out there and play baseball or go to the adult rec soccer league, fantastic, great. But what jumps to my head is, as we continue to age down the road, and this was when I had some exposure to working with seniors population and people 60, 70 and north of that, one of the largest things that affects that population is just falls, quite frankly. Yeah. And as people tend to get older and older, they tend to shuffle, they tend to not pick their feet up as high. And so there's a huge segment of the population that don't work out, they don't do CrossFit, but they trip and fall over something that's not that high off the ground, an inch off the ground. It catches their toe or catches whatever. And then they start to go down, and now they haven't been working out. They're not athletic. They're not coordinated. They're not strong. They're frail. And, a bad situation happens. They're not going to brace their fall well. When they hit the ground, they're going to be less resilient to that impact and all that stuff. And so, some dot drills, some lateral line hops, some heel to toe walking, almost like in a DUI test, things like that help your balance. I mean, those have value, those have benefit, and I'll put them in probably twice a week into the programming as optional work if people want to do it, and it's after the warm up but before the workout. And hey, a couple times a week, here are some dot drills, here's some lateral line hops, here's some whatever it happens to be, and it'll be on a workout that makes sense. It would make sense to do something like that if we're going to do death by 10-meter shuttle sprints that have a lot of stop, start, rotation, pivot, things like that, acceleration, deceleration. Yes, it's a great day to put in something like that as well. So I think there's a lot of stuff, not only to the recreational athlete, but to the just looking down the road as to what seems to happen to human beings as the decades creep by. I think it's nice to keep the dust off of that, to some degree.
I completely agree. And I'll take that another step, Pat, and say that I think there's a whole host of items within the CrossFit sphere that people get really, really lazy about, in the sense that they don't really explore them anymore. They have one outlet, and I beat this drum all the time, but they kind of have their one idea as to what this thing does, and then they don't explore it beyond that. And I think that's a real shame. So a couple of easy examples. Learn to jump rope. And I'm not talking about learning how to do double unders, although that is one thing to do with the jump rope. There's so many other things to explore that are so good for your coordination, your timing, your finesse. And people just turn it into, well, I learned a double under and that's it. It's like, man, you're missing the boat. There's so many cool athletic things. There's a reason that every finesse fighter on earth can jump rope like a maniac. There's a reason for that. It's not just arbitrary. Basic gymnastics are another great example. People, they get really caught up on learning to do a butterfly pull-up and a muscle up, and then maybe a kipping handstand push-up, and they're like, great, I got it, check the box, gymnastics. It's like, well, when's the last time you pulled out some mats and you practiced doing some forward rolls or some backward rolls or some cartwheels? These are basic things that don't take a lot of practice to have some huge carryover and some real benefit to all sorts of things down the stream. You don't have to become an expert. You don't have to learn a tumbling pass, but some of those very, very basic skills can radically expand your basic athleticism. And people don't engage with them really because you don't see them come up in the workout often. And I think it's a real shame. So there are tons of opportunities within kind of what's going on within the CrossFit realm where people have kind of truncated their training and stopped exploring. And I think there's a huge opportunity there if you're open to it. And being open to it means you're probably not going to look great for a while, and that's okay.
Right,
and that's a hard part to it, is that you can be a really advanced CrossFitter and engage with some of these things, and you're like, well, day one, it's going to look like day one, and that's okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agreed. And athleticism is, I think we've hit it pretty well, but athleticism is an interesting thing too, because I almost feel like it's not fair. Like, I feel like with regards to athleticism, I don't want to say that you either have it or you don't. Don't get me wrong. I think if some of the world's best coaches came up to myself and my fellow cohorts of non-athletic people, that we would improve a little bit. But I don't think anyone would ever be like, man, they're so athletic now. I just, and I see that I watch kids' sports all the time. We take our sons to football, lacrosse, basketball, soccer. They play all the sports. And some of these kids have been playing sports for years and years and years, doing the same drills, right? And then after 5 years, there is the top 15% that have been doing the same drills, and they look like magic on the field, even though they've been attending the same practices, doing the same thing. So why is that? There's an interesting component of athleticism, but it put in the work, do your stuff and whatnot. But if you're talking like top tier athleticism, I'm okay with knowing that I'll never get there. I'm going to just try to not slip and fall. That's me.
I believe in you, Pat. I think you can achieve that. I could not agree more. I think we've all met those people that they're just, for lack of a better term, they're just wired a little bit differently. It's like, man, with no for practice or no kind of thinking about it, they can just pull off these amazing feats of coordination and athleticism, where there's people that practice for months and years and they can't touch them.
It's not fair.
And I think I'll go so far as to say that you can see that for many, many attributes. I think athleticism is certainly one of them.
Correct.
But you can see that in the gym with some of these other attributes as well. Like, we've all known the person that comes in on day one and they're like, oh, what's this movement? It's called a deadlift. That's kind of funny. And they're pulling 405 on the first day. And you're like, oh my goodness, it took me a decade to get close to that. And you're just ripping it on day one. Yep. Their capacity for strength is just phenomenal. And you may never be able to catch up to that. But it's not to say that you, wherever you are as an individual, cannot continue to progress. So I think, it's important to focus on that and just recognize that, sometimes that gap that's just the reality. Life ain't fair,
Life ain't fair. Well, I think that's nicely wrapped up. Anything else?
No, that was a fun topic. I enjoy that one.
Well, hopefully, Coach J-Mac, hopefully we helped in some way, shape, or form. As we always say, we'd love to hear everybody else's 2 cents on athleticism, developing it, maintaining it, being a later in life athlete that maybe you're seeing it deteriorate a little bit. Any of your thoughts, put them down there in the comments. Kind of find this show on the btwb YouTube channel. And if you have an idea for a future show, let us know. Obviously, we pay attention to those comments as well. And if you'd like to help support the show, check out the VNR cycles. If you go to the show notes on the btwb YouTube channel, you can find it under this episode. All kinds of cool programs to get your first pull up, muscle up, handstand walk. There's some barbell stuff in there, so hopefully you find them enjoyable. For Adrian Bosman, I'm Pat Sherwood, and we will see you next time.